4 a.m., west of Grafton, West Virginia. The cupola stove crackles, low and slow, the only sound for 100 miles. A brakeman watches his freight trace a long red curve into the dark. For 96 years, every American freight train ended in a car like this. Conductors slept in it. Brakemen died in it. The first rail labor union was founded inside one in 1883. Then, on October 15, 1982, 10 men in Washington signed a single piece of paper. That signature did not retire a rail car. It ended 45,000 jobs. The device that replaced it cost less than a pickup truck. Susquehanna Division, 1863. Before the caboose, freight trains had no rear shelter. The conductor rode wherever he could find a seat, sometimes on a flat car, sometimes in the lee of a boxcar, sometimes on top of the train in the rain. The brakeman had it worse. When the engineer blew his whistle to slow down, they ran along the rooftops in any weather, turning a wheel on each car by hand to set the brakes. Men fell. Men froze. Men were swept off bridges in the dark. The fix came by accident, and the credit is still contested. The most repeated story is that a conductor named Nat Williams, working the Auburn and Syracuse line in upstate New York, dragged a chair and a few crates into an empty boxcar at the back of his train. He cut a hole in the roof so he could look out over the cars ahead. By the late 1840s, railroads were building rear cars on purpose, calling them cabin cars, then way cars. Then, by an etymology nobody can fully trace, cabooses. The car grew, it got a stove, it got bunks, it got a cupola, the small wooden box on the roof where a man could stand up and watch the length of his own train. In every meaningful sense, the caboose became the train's home. Conductors slept in the bunks on long runs through the Alleghenies. Brakemen warmed cans of beans on the cast iron stove, which hissed when snow blew in through the cupola. A kerosene lamp swung above the desk where the conductor kept his waybills, his pocket watch, and his pencil sharpened on a knife. Then, George Westinghouse changed the math. In 1869, a 22-year-old inventor in Pittsburgh patented the air brake. It meant that one man in the cab of the locomotive could now stop a train of 50 cars at once, automatically, by releasing pressure in a single line that ran the length of the consist. The brakeman no longer had to ride the rooftops. The caboose did not vanish. It transformed. With the brakeman pulled inside, the rear of the train became something closer to a regulated workplace. That workplace needed a union. It got one in Oneonta, New York. On September 23, 1883, 8 brakemen climbed into Delaware and Hudson Caboose, number 10, a small four-wheeled wooden car parked in the D&H yard, and signed the bylaws of the Brotherhood of Railroad Brakemen. Their wages averaged just over $1 a day. 1 in 3 of them would be injured before the year was out. They drafted the document at the desk inside that caboose, under a kerosene lamp. That car is still there. It sits today in a glass enclosure in Neowa Park. The same wood, the same bunk, the same window. The Smithsonian once asked to move it to Washington. Oneonta refused, but the air brake was just the first machine. More were coming. Every one of them would take something from the men who worked the rear of the train. The next machine arrived in pieces. It came over 40 years, in the form of small inventions that nobody on the rear of the train recognized as a threat. Each invention solved a real problem and was sold as progress. None of them, by themselves, looked like a threat to the men in the wooden car at the back of the train. Together, they were doing something else. The first piece was the two-way radio. In the years after the Second World War, Motorola and General Electric began selling rugged VHF radio sets to American railroads. Before the radio, the rear-end crew communicated with the engineer by hand signal, by lantern at night, by the long whistle of the air horn, and, when all else failed, by a man on foot running forward along the right-of-way. By the late 1950s, the engineer in the cab of a Union Pacific or a Santa Fe locomotive could speak directly to the conductor in the caboose, a mile and a half down the consist, by pressing a button. The flagman ran fewer errands. The lantern came down off its hook. The second piece was the hotbox detector. A railroad axle bearing, when it failed, would seize, glow red, smoke, and sometimes catch the wooden journal box on fire. For 70 years, watching for hotboxes was the cupola's primary job. A brakeman or conductor sat there and scanned the train, looking for smoke or sparks, listening for the squeal of a dry bearing. In 1956, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway installed the first commercial trackside hotbox detector, an infrared scanner manufactured by the Servo Corporation of America in Hicksville, New York. The scanner sat beside the rail. As each car passed, it read the temperature of every wheel bearing and reported any anomaly to the dispatcher. The cupola's eye had been replaced by a steel post. The caboose, in those years, was a machine watching its own organs replaced one by one. The radio took its mouth. The hotbox detector took its eyes. Each substitution was small. None of them alone made the car obsolete. Together, they were doing arithmetic. Then, in 1969, on a stretch of the Florida East Coast Railway south of Jacksonville, a small electronic box was bolted to the rear coupler of a freight train. It was the size of a lunchbox and blinked red. Inside the housing sat an air pressure transducer, a battery, and a low-power radio transmitter. The crew called it FRED, Flashing Rear End Device. Its function was simple. It monitored brake pipe pressure at the back of the train, broadcast that reading by radio to the engineer in the cab, and carried a marker light visible from a mile away. It cost less than $2,000 to build. Almost nobody outside the FEC paid it any attention. The Florida East Coast was a non-union railroad in the middle of a labor strike that had been going on since 1963. Most of the industry filed FRED in a folder marked "Interesting" and forgot about it. The math was already moving. In 1973, the United Transportation Union, the same organization the Brotherhood of Railroad Brakemen had become, signed an agreement permitting two-man crews on yard jobs. The fireman position had been negotiated out of existence 9 years earlier. A second yard brakeman now followed. Each round of bargaining was framed as a small concession in exchange for higher hourly pay. Each round took another seat off the train. Therefore, by 1980, every function of the caboose existed somewhere else, in a sensor, a radio, a wire. The car still rolled at the back of the train, but the work it had been built to do had already left the building. The car had survived the inventions. It would not survive the lawyers. On October 14, 1980, President Jimmy Carter signed the Staggers Rail Act into law. The bill dismantled most of the federal pricing controls that had governed American railroads since 1887. For the first time in nearly a century, the carriers could reopen contracts with labor on terms of their own choosing. The industry already had its priority list. At the top of it sat the caboose. By 1980, a new bay window caboose cost as much as $80,000 to build. Every through freight movement that carried one added another $1,300 in operating costs, between maintenance, lighting, paperwork, and the wages of the two crew members who lived inside it. Across the country's largest railroads, the line items ran to several $100 million a year. None of that money made anyone any money. In the language of the accountants, the caboose was non-revenue equipment. It earned nothing. It only spent. The first fight was at the state level. For most of the 20th century, certain states had passed what were known as full crew laws, statutes that mandated a minimum number of crew members on every freight train operating within their borders. Indiana required a flagman. Arkansas, before its repeal in 1972, had required 5. Several other states from New York to Texas had similar laws on the books in some form. To eliminate cabooses, the railroads first had to eliminate the laws that mandated the men who rode in them. Conrail, Burlington Northern, and Union Pacific went legislature by legislature through the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, sending lobbyists, drafting model bills, funding ballot campaigns. One by one, the laws came down. Inside the union halls, the men who would lose those seats understood what was happening. The caboose was the last seat at the table. Once it was gone, the rear brakeman, the flagman, and the second conductor would have nowhere to physically stand on a freight train. The seat would take the man with it. 1973 had been about yard jobs. Two-man crews on switching duty indoors, where the savings were small and the jobs were clustered close together. October 15, 1982, was about everything else. The long-haul trains crossing the Powder River Basin, the Tennessee Pass, and the high desert outside Cheyenne. Every brakeman, every flagman, every rear-end conductor the caboose had ever carried. On that day, the United Transportation Union and the National Railway Labor Conference signed the National Agreement of 1982. Inside the document, 2 clauses did the work. Article 10 authorized the elimination of cabooses on up to 1/4 of through freight movements, with that share scheduled to grow in subsequent rounds of bargaining. Section 7 spelled out the conditions. Existing employees were protected against immediate layoff. Future employees were not. The vote inside the UTU was contested. Older trainmen, men in their 50s with 30 years of seniority, voted against. They had grown up in cabooses. They knew what was coming. The younger members, many of them hired in the 70s, voted for the deal. The buyouts were generous, and the wage increase that came with the agreement was real. The union ratified. Days later, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers walked out on strike. The engineers were the older brotherhood, the conservative wing of rail labor that had stayed out of the UTU merger in 1969 and rarely struck at all. Their last major national walkout had been in 1946. Congress imposed a settlement within the week. The strike was over before it had a chance to be heard. But on paper, the deal still looked manageable. Attrition, buyouts, a few thousand jobs phased out gracefully over a decade. The reality, when it arrived, was nothing like the paper. The retirements began before the ink was dry. By the end of 1983, Conrail and Burlington Northern were already pulling cabooses off through freights in the Midwest and the Powder River Basin. By 1985, the Federal Railroad Administration's approval of the end-of-train device, granted quietly in 1981, had cleared away the last regulatory friction. Long lines of cabooses began appearing in the back lots of major yards, parked on weeded sidings, doors hanging open in the wind. The crews who had worked them did not come back. From Roseville, California, to Bailey Yard, Nebraska, to Selkirk, New York, the same image repeated itself across the country. Rows of red and yellow cars sat on dead track, paint fading, journals dry, the small interior smells of coal smoke and waybill ink slowly leaching out into the open air. The cabooses had outlived their purpose by a few months, and now they were waiting for the scrappers. The thing replacing them was already up to its job. That little blinking box, first bolted to a rear coupler in Florida in 1969, had quietly turned into a federal standard. By 1985, every Class I railroad in the country had Freds in inventory. The early ones were dumb units. The newer ones were average intelligence, with a brake pipe pressure gauge and telemetry to a head-of-train device in the locomotive cab that crews started calling Wilma. A Fred cost about $4,500 by the late 1980s. A caboose cost $80,000. The math had a name. A freight rolling past Altoona, Pennsylvania, in 1985 still carried the long, low whistle of the lead unit and the answering call of a marker lamp through the Pennsylvania mountain night. 2 years later, the same train, on the same track, rolled past with the same engine and the same length, and the rear of it was silent. There was no marker lamp behind the cupola, because there was no cupola. There was a small electronic chirp every 90 seconds as the Fred tested its battery, and there was the wind. That was all. Through the second half of the 1980s, between 40 and 45,000 brakemen, flagmen, and rear-end conductors lost their jobs. Many were in their 50s. Many had come into the trade in the 1950s, sons of railroaders, with no other professional skills than what a freight train had taught them. In Altoona, Conrail's furloughs ran in waves, hundreds at a time. In Havre, Montana, on Burlington Northern's Highline Division, third-generation rail families packed up and left town. The buyouts the union had called generous in 1982 added up, in retirement, to less than a year's wages for many of the older men. By 1988, the Association of American Railroads had a number on what the deal had been worth. The AAR's president, William Dempsey, told the Washington Post that the industry had been spending about $400 million a year on cabooses. The same article noted that the railroads had earned $1.3 billion in profit in 1986. Eliminating the caboose, in other words, had been worth more than a quarter of the entire industry's profitability that year. The 45,000 jobs lost on the rear of the train, set against that figure, did not cost the carriers very much at all. That was, on reflection, exactly the point. Norfolk Southern retired its entire caboose fleet by 1987. CSX followed by 1989. Union Pacific had run a fleet of 1,265 cabooses at the beginning of 1985. By the start of 1996, only 201 remained. The rest had been sold for scrap, donated to towns and museums, or quietly converted to shoving platforms for backup moves. A century of service ended on a spreadsheet line. But somehow, against every projection in every shareholder report, the caboose did not actually die. Not all of them. Not entirely. A few of them survived. They survived in places nobody had thought to look. On Norfolk Southern locals in the Detroit area, on CSX yard jobs in Rochester, New York, on Oak Point Yard in the Bronx, a handful of cabooses are still in service in 2026, repurposed as shoving platforms, places for a conductor to stand during long backup moves over road crossings or onto industrial spurs. They are not called cabooses anymore. The companies prefer the term shoving platforms or crew transfer cars. But they are the same cars, in some cases the same numbers, with the same cupola windows looking out over the same diminished trains. The cabooses that are still red, still numbered, and still riding the rails for their original purpose are riding tourist track. The Strasburg Railroad in Pennsylvania runs a bay window car at the rear of every excursion. The Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad, threading the New Mexico-Colorado border on 3 feet of narrow gauge, still operates wooden cabooses behind its 1925 K-37 locomotives. The Durango and Silverton, climbing the Animas River Canyon on the same track since 1882, treats the caboose as part of the experience, not a piece of nostalgia. A second life is in private hands. A restored bay window caboose, depending on condition and provenance, sells for somewhere between $15,000 and $40,000 on the collector market. People buy them as cabins, as backyard offices, as bed and breakfasts in towns along old right-of-ways in Vermont, in Colorado, in West Texas. Boston and Maine caboose number 483, originally built in 1921 and rebuilt as a steel car in 1959, has changed hands 3 times since its retirement, ending up at the Adirondack Scenic Railroad of Utica, New York. The car will probably outlive its current owner. The owner before and the owner before him are already gone. The rest are in museums. The B&O Railroad Museum in Baltimore, the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento, Steamtown National Historic Site in Scranton, and the Henry Ford in Dearborn all keep cabooses on display. Hundreds of small-town municipal parks across the country have one too, a single retired caboose sitting in a fenced enclosure on a piece of donated track, paint bright, doors locked, a brass plaque with a fading paragraph of history. The cars have outlived the men who worked them. The conductors who slept in those bunks in the 1960s are mostly gone now. The brakemen who climbed those ladders in the 1970s are mostly retired. The cabooses still sit, hosed down, repainted every few years, open to school children on weekend tours. The men did not get hosed down or repainted. They went to where men go. This is not, in the end, a story about a rail car. It is a story about evidence. For roughly a century, moving freight across the United States required 5 people on every train. By the early 1990s, it required 2. The argument the railroads made, and the argument that won, was that the other 3 were unnecessary, that automation had made the caboose a relic of a more cautious era. Maybe. The other reading is that the work those 3 men did had to go somewhere, and it did. It went to trackside detectors and algorithms, to a smaller crew working longer hours on longer trains, to a system that has, in the years since, produced a steady drumbeat of derailments, near misses, and the occasional catastrophe in towns that used to have a flagman watching the rear of the train. The small 4-wheeled wooden caboose where the Brotherhood of Railroad Brakemen was founded in 1883 is still in Oneonta, New York. It sits inside a glass enclosure in Neowa Park. The same wood, the same bunk, the same window. The brakemen who signed the bylaws inside it on September 23, 1883, are gone. The union they founded merged into the United Transportation Union in 1969, and the UTU itself merged into SMART in 2012. The job class the bylaws had protected ended in the decade after Article 10. The caboose is still there. It outlived everything.